Greetings. This is the one you've known as Jesus the Christ. In service to understanding this great mystery of divine incarnation or embodiment, it may be helpful to be aware of some of the pitfalls on the spiritual path. To begin with, although effort and vigilance regarding the ego are required to awaken from the ego, too much pushing and striving to be free of the ego can be a pitfall. Pushing and striving in regard to spiritual attainment, as with anything else, is a sign of the ego. The ego pushes to achieve some perfected state that it imagines exists, and in this way continues to cause suffering. You'll never be perfectly free of the ego. In any moment, a remnant of the ego can always be found, if only in seed potential. If you go looking for the ego in your speech and behavior, you'll be able to find it a little, if not a lot. Finding it in others is especially easy. Do be on the lookout for the ego, but please be careful not to turn this teaching into a reason to be judgmental of yourself or others, or self-righteous. That would surely mean your ego was back in charge. The ego is programming, some of which you need. As long as you're in a human form, the faults entailed in this programming have to be accepted and put up with. Even when much of your ego is gone, you won't always be kind. You won't always be sensitive. You won't always be courageous. And you won't always speak the highest truth. Do your best to be your divine self in the world, and love yourself even when you fail, and love others even when they fail. Sometimes the best and only thing you can do is to forgive your imperfections and those of others, and keep trying to do your best. Another pitfall is going too far in the opposite direction. You might indulge your bad habits, addictions, and imperfections because you realize they have nothing to do with who you really are. Some who have some spiritual understanding or who've had some realization of the truth lose interest in refining their personality or don't care how they behave or what impact they might be having on others. They've seen the truth about the nature of reality, and to them it can seem like what they do and how they behave doesn't matter, but it does. If you're being dismissive, detached, or insensitive to others in your everyday life, you need to look at that and not just brush it off as, "Oh, that's just my personality," or "that's their problem," or "it's all an illusion." Any indifference about how you behave or unkindness towards others is a sign the ego is back in charge. Such indifference is not non-attachment or spiritual freedom, but the ego corrupting one's spiritual understanding or co-opting one's spiritual attainment. Some who've had a very deep realization of the truth feel they've transcended the human experience altogether. They may stop referring to themselves in the first person, as if their body-mind has nothing to do with them. For example, they might say, "This body is thirsty," or "From here the experience is." Although this language may represent their experience more accurately than the usual language, not participating in common language is a subtle way the ego expresses a sense of superiority and creates separation from others and from life. Some people never get beyond this stage because they believe they've achieved the ultimate enlightened state, since extreme detachment from the world can feel that way to those experiencing this. Although such detachment is a big relief from human suffering, any lack of interest in the world and lack of concern for others reflects a lack of spiritual integration. The integrated state is one of compassion and deep love for life in all its manifestations. Until the divine is embodied as fully as possible and life is fully embraced, the human experience is not complete. You've taken on a birth to be both human and divine. Another pitfall is spiritual pretense, or pretending you're accepting, loving, and at peace when you're not. Many have some familiarity with presence and have had glimpses of the deeper reality as a result of meditation or spiritual experiences. When that's lost or obscured by the ego, they may try to give the impression, either through their actions or their speech, that they're still in touch with presence. Some might feel the need to fake this because of some confusion around the difference between these temporary experiences and self-realization. Although experiences of presence and spiritual experiences often have a profound impact on one's life, possibly even changing the course of one's life, they're temporary and do not result in a permanent shift to presence as one's essential identity. What these experiences do is give people a glimpse of presence and the deeper reality, inspire people to pursue spiritual life, and pave the way for a more permanent realization. Self-realization, or awakening, is a permanent shift in identity to that of the divine self. With self-realization, you no longer believe yourself to be the false self, but are seated firmly in the divine self. Self-realization is realizing your essential identity as presence and knowing this unshakably, beyond a doubt. It is not an intellectual realization, which is a common misunderstanding. Self-realization cannot be achieved by the mind through any kind of examination or understanding. It cannot be achieved by you at all. You don't realize anything. The realization is that the you that you thought you were never did exist in the first place. Although spiritual practices prepare the ground for self-realization, it is grace that delivers it when the time is right. Once you've had such a realization, it doesn't leave you. Just to be clear, self-realization or awakening is only the beginning of what I'm calling the process of enlightenment, which brings increasingly more divine light into the body. Of course, divine light filters into the human self before self-realization as well, but this process accelerates significantly after self-realization. The process of enlightenment parallels the process of detachment from one's thought stream and the emptying out of thoughts from the thought stream. This emptying out makes room for the divine self to express itself through the human. The process of enlightenment is the process of divine incarnation or embodiment of the divine self. Enlightenment itself, as I'm defining it, is the completion of that process. Unfortunately, these terms aren't used consistently by spiritual seekers or even by many spiritual teachers, so confusion abounds. Another difference between a spiritual experience and self-realization is that you generally wouldn't be able to function in the state you're in during a spiritual experience if that state were to continue. After self-realization, however, the state you remain in, presence, is very ordinary and very functional. Spiritual seekers often mistakenly believe that self-realization or enlightenment is like a non-stop spiritual experience, when it's actually a very ordinary state. It is your natural state, not an altered state of consciousness. Just as those who've had some experience of presence might imitate being in present when they're not, spiritual seekers who've not had any such experience might try imitating those who have. Many have studied the teachings thoroughly enough and sat with enough teachers to know how someone who is awake or self-realized talks and behaves, and they may try to act accordingly. Many of the practices given by spiritual teachers, such as the practices of gratitude and loving kindness, are actually descriptions of what someone who is self-realized naturally does. However, performing these practices is not the same thing as pretending to feel a certain way. These spiritual practices act as bridges, which take one into an authentic experience of gratitude and love. The problem with pretending to feel grateful, loving, compassionate, accepting, or peaceful when you aren't is that this is not being authentic. When you're trying to act a certain way, you're not being present. Rather, you're trying to conform to an idea in your mind of how you think you should be. Only the ego would do that, most likely to try to gain approval or respect. If you were actually present instead of trying to match an image in your mind, gratitude, love, acceptance, compassion, and peace would be there genuinely. Although acting lovingly is certainly preferable to acting unlovingly, how much better it is if you can be that way authentically. Being authentic or being honest with yourself about what's arising in you in the moment, whether that be anger, grief, fear, or conceit, and being willing to look at that, is the way to achieving the more purified personality that one might be trying to fake. Being honest with yourself and bringing awareness to that will shed light on any blind spots where the ego might be hiding. As a shadow is dispersed in the light, so is the ego dissolved in the light of awareness. If you're being inauthentic, however, you're denying any ego that is there and hiding it from others. The trouble with this is that an unacknowledged ego cannot be dissolved. Being authentic doesn't mean acting out your ego when ego is there. That's just indulgence. Being authentic means being willing to admit to and take a look at any ego that might be lurking in you. Presence is this willingness to look. This looking reveals what you might not want to see about yourself and frees you from it. If you aren't willing to be honest with yourself and look, and to be humbled by what you find, your spiritual unfoldment won't progress as quickly as it might. The process of bringing more divine light into the body is one of continual humbling. Humility is a byproduct of the spiritual path, and why humility is cultivated in the various spiritual traditions. What is humbled is, of course, the ego. This humbling, little by little, lowers the ego down from its perch. Although this hurts when it happens, the hurt doesn't last for long, as the rewards become obvious. That perch never did feel that good, and not having to maintain one's superiority is a great relief. Thus the ego is chipped away, one pretense or lie at a time. The divine self is fine with the imperfections and messiness of being a human being. It loves the human experience. This is a grand drama, a grand duality, human and divine, learning to coexist in one form, operating amongst other imperfect, evolving human beings. What a wonderful challenge the divine self has given itself to test its mettle. The divine self is never harmed by mistakes or even by the most unspeakable acts. Life is like a play that way. The characters love each other, hate each other, and sometimes even kill each other. And at the end of the play, they take off their costumes and go out for a drink. In the end, a good time was had by all. This may sound insensitive to those who suffer so greatly in this grand drama, but please remember that you are not only the actors in the drama, but also the scriptwriter. It is your play. You are doing it all. No one is doing anything to you. You are the divine scriptwriter and the human actor. The difference between a play and life is that, over the course of hundreds of lifetimes, the divine succeeds in infusing its magnificence into each human character it plays. So unlike the actors in a play who keep repeating the same drama, you evolve and become glorious by the end of all your lifetimes. You become Christ-like, a master, free of the villain ego, which caused all the pain and suffering. In the end, the divine self shines. Life has a happy ending in store for everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being open to this message. I am with you always.